It's Bucket. The Dyson Cube Project is a brand new mod that was just added to allthemods 10 in version 4.13. The Dyson Cube is based on a Dyson Sphere or Dyson Swarm. If that means nothing to you, long story short, we're going to be building a structure around the sun to generate power. How much power does this make? 1 billion FE per tick. Now there isn't actually a lot to this mod. The first thing that you're going to want to craft is an EM rail ejector controller. This is what we're going to use to set up our Dyson Cube infrastructure. Oh, who am I kidding? We're building a friggin' railgun, and we're going to be using this to shoot our Dyson Cube into the sun. Cool. Do you know what else is cool? Over time, you'll actually be able to see your Dyson Cube forming over the sun. Now, I'd say this probably looks best without shaders, although I am using complementary shaders that come with the pack. Now, if you run these shaders as well, if you're on the default settings, it might look like this. So my suggestions for you want to go to your shader settings, atmosphere, and first, I'm actually going to go to clouds and turn down the clouds so you can see the sun better. I'm running complementary unbound, so in unbound cloud settings, let's bring the cloud amount to 0.8. Now back to atmosphere, you're going to want to go into sun moon. Setting your sun moon style to reimagined is going to give you a square sun to match your Dyson Cube. And then setting the angle to 0 is going to properly line up the sun with your Dyson Cube. Alright, back to our railgun. How do we set this up? There are two different items that we can load into our railgun. Beams and solar sails. First, you're going to want to load up beams. So these are going to get launched into the sun and they're going to essentially form the frame of your Dyson Cube. In other words, you'll see that once these beams get launched, we're now going to have the option to send solar sails as well. Once we send up the solar sails, these are going to be absorbing the sun's energy and producing power. For every beam that we send up, we can support 6 solar sails. And each solar sail is going to generate 20 FE per tick. And that's actually it. After that, we don't actually need to touch our solar sails at all. Once we have them set up, this number is how much power we're going to keep getting. Forever. Well, kind of, but we'll get to that. Once we have solar sail set up, to collect power, we're going to need a ray receiver controller. This in itself can hold 100 million FE. And on top of that, this will be able to transfer power at 50 million FE per tick. Now, if we want to pipe items to the railgun or extract power from the ray receivers, you'll only be able to do so from the bottom side of the middle block. And yes, you can also soul surge the railguns. But remember, everything has to be done from this bottom side of the middle block, which means that this is also the only side that will be able to soul surge. But if we do soul surge it, that means we're going to need a wireless method to send items. Some examples that we can use: modular routers, entangled blocks, scry's linkage, all of these work for this. So as an example, I have these railguns on platforms that I can access from the bottom side. I've also got a distribution module, and with this, I can right click the bottom side of the middle block for up to 8 targets. Put this into a modular router with up to 9 speed upgrades and 6 stack upgrades. And then you just have to provide solar sails or beams. I'd probably have a separate router for each. So one of the problems with the Dyson Cube is that it does run into similar issues to solar panels. Both the rail receivers and railguns won't work at night, and also won't work if it's raining. Personally, I feel like this kind of defeats the purpose of sticking solar panels on the sun, but well, that's the way it works. The railguns also won't work when the sun's at its peak. In other words, they'll stop working between 11 AM and 1 PM in-game. So of course, there are ways to work around these daytime restrictions. You can automate the time of day using something like automated Ars rituals or celestial manipulators. But do they work the same way in different dimensions? So of course, to find this out, I went ahead and tested every dimension in allthemods 10. And here's what I found out. So it turns out the railguns seem to work all around the clock in the other Eternal Starlight dimension and the Twilight Forest dimension. If you had to choose, I'd say that the Twilight Forest is probably going to be the easiest one to get to out of the 3. So I did find a spot where the railgun wouldn't work, but honestly, I'm not really sure why. It's definitely not a line of sight thing because my railgun in the Eternal Starlight also had no problem firing into a wall, but also away from the Dyson Cube. Modern Minecraft, am I right? Now in these 3 dimensions, unfortunately, the ray receivers won't work. However, the ray receiver does work around the clock in the ether dimension. However, if it rains in the overworld, you're out of luck. Unfortunately, you won't be able to work around this by being in another dimension, because if it rains in the overworld, it rains everywhere. So then you are going to want to automate clear weather. And of course, there are a number of ways to do this. Probably the easiest way is having a celestial manipulator and a wind vane. Now, the celestial manipulator should have the correct settings by default, but within the celestial manipulator, you want to go to configure redstone and make sure that clear skies is selected. Then you'll need to power the celestial manipulator and we'll need to place the wind vane next to it. Now, if it starts raining, the wind vane will send out a redstone signal, which will trigger the celestial manipulator, which of course we have set to clear the rain. If the celestial manipulator is on the expensive side for you, I did also explain how you can do this with Ars in a previous video, so if you want to try that, I'll leave a timestamp link to that in the description. Okay, so how do we set these up? So the only things we're going to need to do is constantly supplying our railguns with beams and sails. Now the problem is, doing them one at a time is going to take forever. Remember, this can make up to 1 billion FE per tick. If each sail makes 20 FE per tick, that's 50 million solar sails. So the first thing that we should do to speed it up is to instead send beam packages and solar sail packages. Beam packages contain 4 beams and solar sail packages contain 8 sails. Now we know from earlier that a beam can support 6 sails. So long story short, to get the optimal ratio, you're going to want 1 railgun doing beam packages and 3 railguns doing solar sail packages. And remember, you'll need a ray receiver for every 50 million FE per tick that you generate. But Bucket, how many should I set up? Okay, so let's get into specifics. First, how many we're going to set up is going to depend on how much power we want and how long we're willing to wait to get there. So this is going to look different depending on how you want your playthrough to go. So we're going to run through some examples, and for these, we're going to assume that your railguns are always running, and I'm going to be rounding up the railgun numbers in multiples of 4. And keep in mind that if you were to use Soul Surge, this process should be 5 times faster. Let's look at some extreme examples first. Let's say you're an all the mods 10 speedrunner. So to figure out our endgame power goal, let's compare to another endgame power source. Let's say a mekanism fusion reactor. This generates 80 million FE per tick, so we're going to use that as our power goal. Now the fastest time completing the pack, I believe, is 10 hours. So if we want our Dyson Cube to produce 80 million FE per tick, we're going to need 2 receivers. And to be able to reach 80 million FE per tick in 10 hours, we're going to need about 148 railguns. Of course, if we give ourselves more time to reach our goal, that's going to mean that we won't need as many railguns. So what if instead we wanted to reach 80 million FE per tick in 24 hours? Then we would only need 64 railguns. But I know there are some of you out there who are completionists. You won't settle for some of the Dyson Cube, you want the entire Dyson Cube. You want to make 1 billion FE per tick. Well, first, we're going to need 20 receivers. Now, if you want to reach 1 billion FE per tick in 24 hours, that means that you're going to need 772 railguns. Okay, but maybe a time frame that's a bit more reasonable. How about a week? That's going to mean that we're going to need 112 railguns. Alright, but extreme examples aside, let's look at some more normal numbers. How long it's going to take you to go through a normal playthrough is going to vary. But for this, let's just say a week. And so if we go back and use our goal of 80 million FE per tick, you're only going to need 12 railguns, which is really not a lot. So how about if we were to use this as a mid-game power source? Let's compare to a mid-game power example. A 5x5x5 reinforced reactor from Extreme Reactors running on uranium makes about 67,000 FE per tick. Now to match this, we only need our minimum setup of 4 railguns. And that's only going to take us around 15 to 20 minutes to reach 67,000 FE per tick. So far, this sounds pretty good. So what's the catch? The cost. On the surface, crafting any of these items seems pretty straightforward, but the cost is going to quickly pile up from the sheer number of items that you're going to need to craft, and that's mostly going to be the solar sails and beams. And so because of that, you're going to be needing a lot of glass, lapis, iron, and copper. So this is how much it costs to build a 5x5x5 reinforced reactor. And this is how much it costs to set up the Dyson Cube to make 67,000 FE per tick. Now this isn't impossible to achieve, but it is definitely quite a bit more expensive. Keep in mind that we're looking at this from an early game perspective, and most of the cost is going to come from solar sails and beams. So if we go back to our example where we make 80 million FE per tick in a week, how much is that going to cost us? And in case you're wondering, here's how much it costs to make 1 billion FE per tick in 1 week. Before you think that Soul Surge is the solution, Soul Surge is only going to speed up your railguns, which means that you might not need as many, but again, most of our cost by far is going to come from the sails and beams, and that cost is unavoidable. But if speed is an issue for you and you feel like you need to use Soul Surge, there's actually another solution. So there was actually an update that came out whilst I was making this video. Now as of this video, this update hasn't rolled out to all the mods 10 just yet, but I'm assuming it will in the next update. So in this update, you can now provide power to your railguns. Again, you'll only be able to do this from the bottom side of the middle block. So how it works is it'll ramp up how many items it sends at a time. So it'll start by sending 1, and then the next cycle it'll send 2, then 3, and so on. Meaning at most, it'll be able to send 64 items at a time. Now by sending more items, it does so at the cost of power, and it is not cheap. So how the power cost is calculated is going to be the number of items sent squared multiplied by 40 FE per tick. So to send a stack at a time, it's going to cost 163,840 FE per tick. Yeah. So how can we actually use this in a way that makes sense? Well, if you're building your Dyson Cube from scratch and this is your only form of power, you probably don't want to do this off the bat. However, let's say that you only need a certain amount of power. Let's say 1 million FE per tick. Now, once we're generating this amount, if we continue to build our Dyson Cube, we're going to have excess power. So we could instead use that to ramp up our railguns. Your ramp up progress is something that you'll need to maintain. Your ramp up progress will actually reset if you don't meet the requirements of the cycle. For example, we know that with every cycle, the railgun will send more items and require more power. If we don't provide it with enough items or enough power, your progress will reset. More specifically though, your progress will only reset if we send the incorrect amount of items. It won't reset if you stop sending items or if you take out the items before they get sent. So you can technically input the correct items manually and maintain your progress. So it's important that we can provide items and power quick enough so that we don't lose our ramp up progress. So the entire railgun cycle is 6 seconds of launch time and 2 seconds of downtime in between. So within the 2 seconds of downtime, we need to make sure that we can send up to a stack of items to make sure that the railguns are topped off. And we also need to provide up to 164,000 FE per tick during the 6-second launch time. So just to clarify, we need to manage multiple inputs, specifically items and power, and we need to be able to input both through the same block face. On top of that, we need to be able to do this quickly as we have a very limited timing window. And we need to be able to do all of this with multiple railguns. And of course, there are multiple ways of doing this, including all the methods that I mentioned earlier. For me, all of these things point to using Super Factory Manager. So for this example, I'm going to have a floor of inventory cables where I'm going to be setting up 12 railguns. I'm going to be pulling items as well as power from an applied logistics interface. Here, I'm using an oversized interface, which is just a bigger version. And remember, you can assign FE by right-clicking with anything that's holding FE. And don't forget the induction card as well. Within the manager block, you can then input a program disk and then hit the edit button to input your code. So here's what my code is going to look like. I'll leave a copy of this in the description as well. The main thing is to remember to specify everything being input from the bottom side of our railguns. Now, the label gun, shift right-click to pull the labels from the manager and right-click in there to select labels. So when we're labeling our blocks, remember we need to be labeling the bottom center block of each railgun. And remembering our ratio, we're going to have 3 beam railguns and 9 sail railguns. Then right-click to push the labels to the manager and we're all good to go. When your railguns are fully ramped up, it might look like this. And this is actually fine. The railguns are actually getting power. If they weren't, you would actually see the power draining. So of course, one last thing to keep in mind, for every railgun that you have, providing a stack of packages every 8 seconds is going to add up. So you're going to need to make sure that you're producing enough resources to be able to keep up with that supply. Now, what does that look like in terms of materials? Well, here's how much it costs to make 64 beam packages and 64 solar sail packages. And remember, the optimal ratio is to have 1 railgun doing beams and 3 doing solar sails. So if we do some quick math here, that means you're going to need this many resources per second or this many resources per tick. And of course, if you're using Soul Surge, all of these numbers become 5 times harder. So should you build a Dyson Cube? The Dyson Cube can produce a ton of power. You can get it going in the early game and have it usable all the way to the end game. The biggest benefit is that it requires no fuel and no maintenance. And if you run the number of railguns and receivers that I've given, this is not going to take very much space at all. Once your beams and sails are set up, you're all set. The downside, of course, is it's very expensive. So the question becomes, how good is your resource production for these particular resources? If you're struggling on resources, this might not be a great option. But this is modern Minecraft. And with mods like Mystical Agriculture and Productive Bees, there are plenty of ways to get an abundance of resources. So maybe you'd prefer to focus on resource production so that you don't have to focus so much on power production. On top of that, it does require quite some time to get this going. The Dyson Cube is probably something that you want to plan your entire playthrough around. This is probably not something that you want to start if you're simply considering late game power options, as it does take quite a considerable amount of time to get it going. That being said, it's not impossible. You just need more railguns. And remember, if you did like this video, don't forget to give it a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with the latest All the Mods 10 related content. Thanks for watching. I'm Bucket, and I'll see you in the next one.